If you bought an electric car this year, there is a better than even chance that the heart of its battery came out of a single country. Not China, not Korea, Indonesia. In 2025, an estimated 63% of all the nickel produced anywhere on Earth, the critical metal inside almost every modern EV battery, was mined and refined here. A decade ago, that number was about 7%. This is the story of how one of the world's most underestimated economies quietly cornered the electric car supply chain. To understand what happened, you have to go back to January 2014. That month, Indonesia did something that sounded, at the time, completely irrational. The country had spent decades as the world's largest exporter of raw nickel ore. Shovel it out of the ground in Sulawesi or Halmahera. Load it onto bulk carriers. Ship it to China for processing. It was easy money, a reliable couple of $1 billion a year. Then the government banned it. Overnight, no more raw nickel ore could leave Indonesian shores. If you wanted Indonesia's nickel, you had to build the smelter inside Indonesia. The reaction from foreign mining companies was immediate and furious. Lobbying intensified. Bilateral pressure piled up. The European Union and Japan eventually took Indonesia to the World Trade Organization, arguing the ban violated free trade rules. Indonesia lost that case in 2022, and then ignored it. In between, Jakarta wobbled. Under heavy industry pressure, the ban was partially relaxed in 2017, with some exemptions granted to firms that committed to building local smelters. But on January 1, 2020, the total ban was reinstated, and this time the doors closed for good. President Joko Widodo's government built the policy into a broader doctrine they called Hilirisasi, Indonesian for downstreaming. The idea was blunt. Indonesia had spent half a century being a raw materials colony for richer economies. It had watched countries like Japan and South Korea industrialize by climbing the value chain, refusing to be just suppliers. If Indonesia controlled the resource, the country reasoned, it could force the factories to come to it. The bet was risky. Smelting nickel is technologically demanding, energy intensive, and capital heavy. Without buyers willing to invest, the policy would have collapsed inside a year. But here is what the planners in Jakarta correctly anticipated. The world was on the verge of an electric vehicle revolution. Demand for high-grade nickel, specifically the Class 1 nickel used in lithium-ion batteries, was about to explode, and Indonesia happened to be sitting on more of it than any other country on the planet. The question was no longer whether anyone would come. The question was who would arrive first. To grasp how completely Indonesia has cornered this market, look at the numbers. In 2015, the country produced roughly 130,000 tons of nickel, about 7% of the global total. By 2024, Indonesian mines were producing 2.2 million metric tons of nickel, a 17-fold increase in less than a decade. That gave Indonesia over 60% of the world's annual nickel supply in 2024. And according to industry projections, the share is on track to reach roughly 63% in 2025. By the end of this decade, analysts at ING and other commodity desks believe Indonesian output will hit 3 million tons, or about 65% of everything mined worldwide. Production share is only half the story. The reserves are what guarantee Indonesia's dominance for the next several decades. According to the United States Geological Survey, Indonesia sits on approximately 21 million metric tons of proven nickel reserves. Somewhere between 42 and 45% of all the proven nickel left on Earth. The Philippines, the second biggest holder, has about 4.8 million tons. Australia has about 4 million. There is no close runner-up. And the dominance now extends well beyond raw mining. In 2023, the most recent year with full trade data, Indonesia accounted for 81% of the world's ferronickel exports, the alloy that goes into stainless steel. It accounted for 47% of global nickel matte exports, an intermediate product used in batteries, and it accounted for 59% of global nickel oxide intermediates, another key battery input. In other words, Indonesia no longer just supplies the world's raw ore. It now controls the choke points in the supply chain for the materials that get fed into battery factories from Shenzhen to Stuttgart. If Indonesia decided tomorrow to halt nickel exports, the global EV industry would not slow down. It would seize up. That is the real meaning of leverage in critical minerals. And Indonesia spent a decade deliberately engineering that leverage, by refusing to play the comfortable role of raw materials supplier. Here is the twist most people miss. Indonesia did not build this industrial empire alone. China built most of it for them. When the 2020 ban hit and Western mining companies refused to invest, one country quietly stepped in: China. Chinese firms had spent the 2010s perfecting cheap, fast smelter construction. They had the capital, and they had the strategic incentive. China is by far the world's biggest consumer of nickel and the dominant producer of EV batteries. So locking down upstream supply mattered as much as any factory they could build at home. Between 2014 and 2025, Chinese companies poured roughly $22 billion into Indonesia's EV and battery supply chain. According to Rest of World's analysis of Chinese outbound EV investment, that figure makes Indonesia the single biggest destination for Chinese EV investment anywhere outside Europe, second only to Hungary in total dollars. CATL, the world's largest battery maker, signed a deal worth nearly $6 billion for a cluster of 6 interconnected projects in Indonesia: nickel mining, smelting, a battery precursor plant, and eventually a finished battery plant. BYD has pledged at least $1 billion for a finished vehicle factory targeting 150,000 EVs per year by 2026. Tsingshan, the Chinese stainless steel giant, anchored both major industrial parks at Morowali in central Sulawesi and Wida Bay in North Maluku. The result is a paradox at the heart of Indonesia's strategy. Jakarta wanted to capture more value, end the resource curse, build national champions, and reduce dependence on foreign powers. What it actually got was an industry that is overwhelmingly owned, financed, and technically managed by Chinese firms. Roughly 70 to 90% of smelting capacity in the Morowali and Wida Bay parks is Chinese-controlled, depending on whose count you accept. So when American or European policymakers worry about Chinese dominance over critical minerals, they often think of mines in Africa or Latin America. They are usually missing the bigger picture. The real action is happening in Sulawesi, where Chinese capital, Indonesian ore, and the world's most coal-intensive industrial parks are quietly assembling the foundation of the global electric vehicle economy. For all the geopolitical complications, the downstreaming policy did exactly what Jakarta promised. It changed the economic identity of the country. In 2013, before the first ban took effect, Indonesia's total nickel-related exports were worth about $6 billion. By 2022, they had hit nearly $30 billion. That is a 5-fold increase in less than a decade, driven not by mining more ore but by exporting higher-value processed products. Stainless steel, battery-grade nickel, intermediate chemicals, for a country whose entire export structure had been built on raw commodities for generations. That was a structural transformation. Then came the EV downstream layer. In July 2024, Hyundai and LG Energy Solution opened Southeast Asia's first EV battery cell factory, a $1.1 billion joint venture in Karawang, West Java, with an annual capacity of 10 gigawatt-hours, enough cells to power roughly 150,000 electric cars per year. BYD broke ground on its own $1 billion plant. So did Citroën. So did Vietnamese maker VinFast. The Indonesian government now estimates the country can assemble around 280,000 electric vehicles per year, and it is targeting 400,000 by the end of 2025. The effect on local EV adoption has been dramatic. In the second quarter of 2025, electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids accounted for 15.2% of all passenger car sales in Indonesia, up from low single digits 2 years earlier. Quarter-on-quarter EV sales jumped 40% in early 2025. Indonesia's total electric vehicle stock crossed 100,000 units in mid-2025. And the government's official target is 2 million EVs and 12 million electric two-wheelers on the road by 2030. What started as a stubborn export ban has become a vertically integrated industry. Ore in Sulawesi, smelters in Morowali, battery cells in Karawang, finished cars rolling off lines outside Jakarta. For a country that not so long ago was a textbook case of resource dependency. The kind of economy that sells raw commodities and imports finished goods. This is something genuinely new in Southeast Asian development. It is, in the truest sense, an industrial policy that actually worked. But the story does not end with the celebratory chart. The same nickel boom that brought factories and foreign investment has also produced one of the most environmentally destructive industrial transformations in Asia. The two industrial parks that anchor the entire nickel revolution, Indonesia Morowali Industrial Park in central Sulawesi and Indonesia Wida Bay Industrial Park in North Maluku, are powered overwhelmingly by coal. By 2025, Morowali alone is expected to have around 5 gigawatts of captive coal-fired generation, making it one of the largest concentrated coal-burning sites anywhere in Asia. In other words, the metal that powers green vehicles in Europe and California is being refined using some of the dirtiest energy on the planet. The local impact is severe. According to Climate Rights International, the number of patients diagnosed with acute respiratory infections in central Wida, a district directly downwind of the smelters, jumped from 434 cases in 2020 to 10,579 cases in 2023. A 24-fold increase in 3 years. Local rivers once used for drinking water have shown dangerously high concentrations of nickel and hexavalent chromium, a known carcinogen. In April 2025, Indonesia's own Minister of Environment publicly acknowledged that small islands surrounding the industrial parks had been, in his words, extensively polluted. The same year, an IUCN Netherlands landscape report calculated that 77% of the nickel concession area in Morowali overlapped with previously undisturbed tropical forest, and that more than 12,000 hectares of that primary rainforest had been cleared by 2023. This is the awkward truth at the center of the global energy transition. Almost every electric car sold in the West carries inside it the embedded carbon emissions of a coal-fired Indonesian smelter, the displaced biodiversity of a Sulawesi rainforest, and the chronic respiratory illnesses of communities whose names you will never hear. None of that shows up in the marketing brochure. The policy success and the environmental crisis are not two different stories. They are the same story, told from two different angles. Indonesia chose growth, jobs, and industrial sovereignty over slower, cleaner development, and the world that buys its nickel has, for now, decided not to look too closely at the price. For more deep dives into the data shaping Asia's economy, subscribe to Asia by the Numbers.